Hello and welcome everyone to this Chatham House webinar. Title is Disinformation and Censorship, Freedom of Expression Online in Southeast Asia. I'll give a brief introduction and then we'll be starting fairly soon with brief presentations from our two panelists who I'll introduce in advance, and then there'll be significant time for questions and answers. So 1 year into the pandemic now, a lot of people are getting really good at using Zoom. People are slicker and hopefully a lot sharper and shorter than was the case all those months ago. And I hope this is going to be a concise and informative session. A couple of quick notes to start. This event is being recorded and it's on the record, so please note that. And it will probably be up on the Chatham House website sometime soon. Members of the audience are invited when it comes around to questions to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So please use that rather than the chat box or the raised hands function or other functions. And we'll seek to note and respond to the questions as best we can as the event moves forward. I'm Adam Burke. I'm the Regional Director of Conflict Programming for the Asia Foundation. We work across Asia, including most of the countries in Southeast Asia. And as with many organizations these days, an increasing number of our programs address challenges that are arising concerning online space in a variety of ways. Our two speakers today are extremely well positioned to contribute to this discussion. For the last 25 years, Gerald Joseph has been a human rights defender and trainer focusing on the rights of Indigenous people, elimination of racial discrimination, and economic, social, and cultural rights. Mr. Joseph is at present a Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, and among an array of national and international responsibilities, he's chaired the ASEAN People's Forum and is currently a board member of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Tess Bakaya is an independent journalist, editor, and media consultant based in the Philippines. Among many past and present roles, Tess has been executive director of the Southeast Asian Press Alliance. She's been a trainer and a lecturer in journalism and is currently the project lead and editor-in-chief of the Asia Democracy Chronicles, a region-wide initiative of the Asia Democracy Network. Her award-winning investigative journalism has been widely published. Today, we're looking at two related issues. The first is a long-term on-running issue of media freedom and freedom of information generally. The second is a little more specific around the manipulation of social media and other online information. Our speakers are going to be addressing both of these important points. And the second point about online media space is especially of contemporary concern as many people are realizing or increasingly coming to terms with. And I'll say a few brief introductory words on that topic. Despite increased efforts by internet platforms such as Facebook to combat internet disinformation, the use of manipulation techniques by governments and by others around the world is still growing. For instance, the head of the organization Internews recently commented that she expected to see online misinformation in every single election that they plan to cover over the next few years. So it's becoming established as a norm rather than an exception or an unusual event. Similarly, researchers from Oxford University in 2019 found that the number of countries with political disinformation campaigns had more than doubled to 70 in the previous 2 years. And now in 2021, it's probably higher still. These problems are as acute in Southeast Asia as they are anywhere and have been so for some time. The Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Chris Wiley, called the Philippines, in the context of misinformation online, a petri dish. He said that his former company experimented with tactics of mass manipulation there and in other countries in the global south. they found that when these tactics worked after the experiments, they then used them in different ways across Western countries, in the US and in Europe. So by now, the manipulation of online space in Southeast Asia has a still longer record than it does in many other parts of the world. It's not something particularly new, and it's not something particularly extreme. It's a mainstream, integral part of media, politics, and security across the region. And on that note, I think it's a good point to turn to our speakers. And first, we have Gerald Joseph to speak for 10 minutes or a little more about these issues from his perspective, from the Malaysian perspective, and the wider perspective. Thank you, Gerald.
Good afternoon. Hi, Adam. Hi, Tess, and friends who have joined us for this discussion. I think a lot of work of concern is Malaysia and the region, and I think the freedom of expression issues that were basically offline before have now moved to areas of concern online, because in Malaysia, I think the recent internet user survey in 2020 showed 88.7% usage of people on the internet, and most of them, 98%, are from using it via smartphone, and with 37 laptop and 16% PC. It just goes to say that this conversation, this last 1 year, has proven the point that we never stop talking offline forums or online. And that's why the freedom of speech and expression is crucially important, and it's guaranteed under our constitution, Article 10. But you know that the state governments always try to say that it's not absolute. We all know that from human rights point of view, no rights are absolute. But the question is, are the restrictions reasonable and within the norms of international law? So while international law demands a balance of these rights, our constitution, while we have the freedom of expression guarantees, we also have very old classic laws that come from the colonial British period, but now have been amended and strengthened, like the Official Secrets Act, enough provision in the Penal Code, the Sedition Act 1948, amended recently, Film Censorship Act, and the Communication and Multimedia Act. These are some of the acts that we worry, because it can be easily used to suppress critical points of dissent. But the good news is that we had a new government in 2018 that lost its power through parliamentary maneuvering, is the correct word. It was not through an election. And so the present government took over the former government that unseated 60 years of the same party, and they managed to repeal the Anti-Fake News Act, which was another round of worry for us, because the ambit of what is fake, not fake, but that's off the law books, which is a sigh of relief. But we have enough laws, right? So the Sedition Act 48, it's so vague that they have terms like seditious tendency. I mean, who decides this? It could be the police, it could be the Attorney General. So, and it has been used with such arbitrary interpretation, and that's why we worry, yeah? In 2015, there was an amendment passed to try to improve the limits and scope of this, but sadly, while the amendments was passed in Parliament, it never was gazetted into law. So there was a little bit of improvement to narrow, but it's not gone further. Then comes this new era of communication and multimedia. I think the online conversations are really worrying. So the powers of this act can shut down, and it's shut down, I think it was like 2 years ago, it was 6,000 websites brought down. I'm sure now it's 10,000 plus. It could be from child pornography to expressions that are critical on incitement, but also an example that sometimes the website is even shut down based on Sharia laws, or state laws, not federal laws. And the Multimedia Commission has shut it down, saying that because it offends another law. Yeah, so I think the word offensive content, I think, needs to be attended to both by the state and also, of course, the content holders of the social media. And I think because the words are so wide, it also says improper use of network facilities. So even the owners of such social media can get into trouble because they can easily be charged with this. And also, I think we have so many laws that are overlapping. So we have the Penal Code, the Film Censorship Act, Sexual Offences Act, and this needs to be streamlined. Under the present Penal Code, it also restricts freedom of speech. Of course, the intention was to prevent violence, but the language is weak again, because it says, whoever intentionally insults, I'm reading section 504, thereby gives provocation to any person, intending, knowing it to be likely that such provocation will cause him to break public peace, and then continue. So these notions of what is breaking public peace. So if I criticize a government policy, is it breaking public peace? Is it making a group of people unhappy? So again, this act has to go. The previous government that came in promised to repeal the Sedition Act. Sadly, with this advent of this new government, there's been silence on a lot of this movement of change. Then there's another part of the Sedition Act. Whoever makes or circulates statement, rumor, or report with intent to cause or which is likely to cause fear. The word which is likely to cause fear and alarm. Again, can you imagine if you're putting a critical comment on Facebook, disagreeing and countering somebody, and if that is to cause fear and alarm, you could also get into trouble. We have also a Film Censorship Act, which is very draconian, because every film in Malaysia, and this is meaning every film is illegal or not allowed to be shown until given permission by this old archaic act. But the good news is this is for film, for videos, for materials, and so far not yet empowered for online. Online is taken by others. So some cases of concern, there was a cartoonist, his name was Fahmi Reza. He did a cartoon clown picture of the former prime minister, who's now charged for serious corruption, Najib. And he was sentenced to jail, fine, and he continues his battle in court. It's another case of a preacher, an Islamic preacher, who was charged under Sedition Act, Section 4, because his statement on Facebook questioning the Sultan. Sultan is a king of a state. We have 9 states in Malaysia, and the local king called Sultan is the head of Islam. But he was talking in terms of whether it is in compliance with the teaching of Islamic State. So he was also charged with sedition. So the other element that is difficult is criticism of royalties has very little space for freedom of expression in Malaysia. It's a sensitive topic, and the police are quick to come after you if you've made a comment. Never mind if that comment by the said royalty is actually against rights, against the law, but it's just making critical comments is difficult. Another well-known artist, cartoonist, Zunar, had 9 sedition charges against him for his critical cartoons. The cartoons were even displayed publicly in Geneva streets for his political, empowering, and critical issues. But in Malaysia, he was charged. Luckily, under the previous government, during that space, all the charges were dropped, or he was not found guilty. That brings us to the point of, we know what the international human rights standards demand. Freedom of expression is a right. You should not find ways to suppress it. But as a government and as a society, a multiracial, multi-ethnic society, which is most of Southeast Asia, the Rabat Plan 6-part threshold test to restrict freedom of expression, I think, is a duty of the government to explain. What's the context of the statement? What is the position of the speaker? That means if you're a higher position, you say something, if it blows out, you have a greater responsibility. The intent, was it intent to incite an audience? What's the content and the extent of dissemination and the likelihood of harm, including imminent? This way then restricts the police or the Attorney General from doing what they think in their mind is danger. And I think the word danger needs to be qualified, and that's what a lot of society has not done. And that's why we call for inclusion on the United Nations Rabat Plan of Action into policy making. I think I go to the final part of some of the challenges in recommendation. I think the media is essential, and now many media is also online, because we don't read newspaper, it's mainly online stuff, and if it's so easy to catch anybody with critical comment, can you imagine a good journalist who does a good job they could also get in trouble because they are not protected by other laws for carrying out their duty to report. So I think protection of human rights defenders and journalists is important if we are going to allow freedom of expression to be the bearer of the truth repository. I think our challenge would be, for me, more human rights is a protection against different forms of freedom of expression, not less. I think this is the framework that we need. Number two, we need to protect people who speak critically, and that includes whistleblower, includes journalists, and they have a big role to speak up. And sometimes saying something that people don't know gets them into more trouble than anything. Also, the transparency of how this moderation is done. So like the Multimedia Commission should be very clear and explicit what you take down, how you decide to take it down, and why do you take it down should be made public, and people can demand that. The concern of security or danger must follow a global common standard. It cannot be Malaysia decides, Philippines decides, Thailand, and everybody decides based on what is good for the government of the day. And that, for me, or the majority of society, and that's not fair. Yeah. So that includes what laws you can use to criminalize. And also, I think there's a lot of work for education of society, how to understand what is it to be offended, insulted, or hurt. Because criticism, different point of view, does not qualify you to use the word insult and hurt and then launch a criminal action against a different group of people who think differently, but not with the intention to insult you. But a difference of opinion should have a space in a mature society. And I think that's where the check and balances for independent commissions like my Human Rights Commission or other commissions an Ombuds Office will be crucially important. I think that's why a part of the UN is to create what's a regulation and a standard regulation, and what's appropriate, proportionate sanctions that the state must do. I think with that, I have come to my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald, for a concise and very clear summary of some of the challenges and the institutions that have adapted over time in Malaysia. Let's move slightly further east to the Philippines and further afield if you wish, Tess. And please take us away.
Thank you, Adam. Hello, everyone. Warm greetings to all. It's my pleasure to be here to be part of today's discussion on what to us is a very important issue, especially for those of us in Southeast Asia, to talk about freedom of expression online in the region. As you might expect, this subject has figured prominently in many reports and even conversations on not a few occasions conducted away from the prying eyes and ears of state authorities. It has also prompted many a campaign by national, regional, and even global advocacy groups for the protection of this very fundamental freedom and its promotion in a region that has seen massive violation of this basic right. Southeast Asia, as you might know, is a very diverse region, composed of 11 countries with an estimated combined population of 655 million. But despite that diversity, there are common threads running through how states deal with, or to be more precise about it, abuse fundamental freedoms, not least of which is freedom of expression, issues around which have been magnified or have intensified with the advent of digital technologies as more people turn to social media or gain access to the internet. Southeast Asia has one of the world's fastest growing internet economies, projected to have hit $105 billion last year. It has around 400 million internet users, and we're talking of just 6 of the largest economies in the region, namely Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The 400 million is about 70% of the population of this, the combined population of these countries. The rise of internet technologies has spawned a host of major problems while providing vast opportunities to share and access information. And one major concern that has sprung on the use of the internet is the spread of disinformation and hate speech already existing even before new technologies came around, considering much of the region's long history of conflict and given its ethnic and religious diversity. Yet, as one report puts it, in the contemporary social media environment, hate speech has spread exponentially along with disinformation, or what is commonly called fake news, and incitement to violence and cyber attacks. These are no doubt legitimate concerns that require wise handling by governments using well thought out and carefully crafted laws, policies, and regulations that will not undermine or compromise basic rights and civil liberties. But as the International Commission of Jurists affirms, these challenges demand genuine law and policy responses. But that's easier said than done. In Southeast Asia, legislation and regulatory action introduced by states ostensibly to address these challenges has instead been used to suppress speech and target critics in violation of human rights law obligations and in a manner that undermines the rule of law. Amid the steady decline of fundamental freedoms in Southeast Asia, freedom of speech has been one of the most abused, if not the most abused. And we see this in the aggressive efforts by governments across the region, mine included, the Philippines, to regulate or nay control the digital sphere to crack down not only on activists and independent media, but just about anyone perceived as critics of the government or seen as threats to public order, quote unquote, or to the national security. This while these governments push their own narratives that drown out legitimate concerns and voices, such as those of the religious minority, and genuine and meaningful public debate on many important issues. Countries such as Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam have passed cybersecurity laws whose definitions of threats to national security have been vague, facilitating interpretation of specific provisions that is arbitrary or selective. And this is one of those common threads. If we talk about the repressive laws in the region that curtail free speech, what all this means is that together with the unparalleled opportunities for enriching public discourse and therefore ensuring a thriving democracy are also enormous challenges exacerbating those problems that had hounded the region even before the internet came about. In the past, we've seen governments curtail free speech by using provisions in the criminal law, criminal code on slander and defamation, for example. These laws have either been expanded or replaced by a new raft of laws, such as those governing telecommunications, cybersecurity, and computer crimes. Take Thailand, for example. The scope of its lèse-majesté laws, in particular Article 112 in its criminal code, which was enacted before the emergence of digital platforms, was extended to include the cyberspace with the passage of the Computer Crimes Act in 2007. As one report says, while lèse-majesté is not explicitly mentioned in the Computer Crimes Act, Thai authorities have sought to criminalize lèse-majesté offenses in cyberspace under the provision of national security. So what we're seeing is that new communications technologies, amid the opportunities and challenges they present, such as the spread of hate speech and disinformation online, have been weaponized by states leery of criticism and any act perceived to be inimical to state interests or national security, again, whose definitions are overly broad and vague. And this trend is not new. I want to highlight that. Southeast Asian governments have for decades crafted and enforced the law to curtail expression and information, and have in recent years extended these old patterns of violation to the online sphere, according to ICJ. As we speak, the military junta in Myanmar wants a draconian law that, according to Human Rights Watch, will grant it enormous powers to, quote, access user data, block websites, order internet shutdowns, and imprison critics and officials at non-complying companies, end quote. No technology has been weaponized at an unprecedented global scale as social media, according to the authors of Architects of Network Disinformation. And this is a glaring reality in Southeast Asia. It seems that authoritarian leaders in the region and those taking an authoritarian turn in their style of government, such as, let's say, Jokowi, Widodo, will stop at nothing to clamp down on their critics or anyone seen as threats to their rule. Hence, there's a growing concern in the region around state-led or state-supported disinformation. There have been talks, for example, in Vietnam of a state-backed hacking group targeting dissidents. And the list goes on and on. And I can't even begin to talk about the situation in my own country. Overall, as free speech and press freedom are weaponized by states online and offline, legal frameworks for the regulation of online speech and those affecting other fundamental freedoms suffer from vague and overbroad provisions, such as what Gerard has mentioned for specific to Malaysia, stipulate severe and disproportionate penalties, especially for online free expression, lack independent oversight mechanisms, and fail to provide effective remedy or accountability, according to ICJ. So how do we deal with these challenges? And I'm winding down. I can count the number of attempts, and even when SIPA was still around, toward this end at various fora. Are the solutions elusive? Maybe not, because in some respects, the answers are staring us in the face. We need human rights, compliant laws, and regulations, to say the least. How to get there is the challenge and requires continuing this kind of conversation, making the most of what is left of our civic space. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tess and Gerald as well, of course, to strong and very contrasting presentations of broad trends across the region, Southeast Asia, and more specific laws, patterns, and risks in Malaysia. I'd encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A box. We've got several already. Let me begin, if that's all right, with what was in fact the first question, which is a fairly specific one for Gerald in particular, about how the new government in 2018 reenacting the Anti-Fact News Act had an effect in the country and what this has meant practically to stopping the spread of fake news in Malaysia. So Gerald, would you like to respond to that? And then we'll move on from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jasami Hardy, for the question. First of all, the fight was the fear of the overreach of what is called an Anti-Fake News Act, because it had provisions of a $500,000 fine or 6 to 10 years jail time, the original act. So getting it out of the law books was important. So I think giving less tools to the state to suppress genuine freedom of expression actors, I think was the motivation, because based on the experience I mentioned earlier, the whole list of old laws. So whether not having an Anti-Fake News Act meant that fake news stopped or limited, that's not the argument we are putting forward, because I think, and many of us think that handling false news or fake news must utilize a different mode, because with the speed of information zooming across from my phone to your phone to all parts of the world in milliseconds, which means that false must be countered with alternative news or information. So governments, instead of prosecuting, are now saying, when there's somebody forwards it, something that says, oh, the minister has said this, the ministry immediately comes up with the same news with a big, bold, false news. So I think this has now become the fashion during the COVID-19. A lot of false information is branded and sent, re-forwarded again, and it sort of takes its life of its own. So I think that's a good lesson the government is learning, that they too must be active participants to give the right information to the public. A public campaign on responsibility. I think, I think many of us, I get a lot of forwarded messages from my auntie, my mother, and everybody who just forwarded with such certainty and clarity that this must be the truth. Either the vaccine doesn't work, or the government is going to collapse or whatever, and then we have to tell them, where did you get this information? Then you explain to them that don't forward unless you know what is true. But that kind of work is a responsibility of society. So public education and campaigning is important. But for me, I agree that the more space of human rights and freedom of expression actually is a contestation of truth and false, and that's how it gets moderated in any case. And I think our challenge is the state also, I think what Tess was saying earlier, even the state can utilize this for false messaging and fake news in order to propagate propaganda. And as long as we are not stopped, so the other side, the NGO, civil society, academics got a chance to even put it out there. So that's how I see fake news management will take on a different mode and method. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald, for that comprehensive response. We've got some excellent questions now coming through. I'm going to jump a little bit to the second question here from Gomez Duque Dario on the prospect for the region regarding hate speech on minorities and political groups, because I think that flows quite well from the current discussion. And the second part of that question is, can it be state-led in order to favor the interests of authoritarian governments? So you've got this clear challenge when, as is so often the case, when the potential transgressor is also the gatekeeper, and how one manages that situation, which is becoming particularly overt in this space across the region and indeed elsewhere. Perhaps if I turn to Tess and then come back to Gerald afterwards on that point. And then after that, we can move on to one or two of the other questions.
The prospect doesn't look very optimistic at this point. At the rate things are going in as far as hate speech is concerned, although there are a lot of efforts, especially coming from civil society groups, to curb hate speech, especially where it involves minorities and political groups. But where the states are involved, consider the example of Myanmar, for example. The example of Myanmar when what happened to the Rohingya years ago, when the military had been accused, and this was documented by us having led the spread of hate speech against the Rohingya people. So if we rely on the states as far as this is concerned, I think that the prospects don't look good at this point if we talk about state-led efforts to and at the rate authoritarianism is spreading in the region, and also at the rate very repressive laws are being passed, the possibility for this kind of issue to be resolved in a positive way, it looks remote as far where I stand or sit. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Gerald, given your huge experience of working on human rights issues in particular, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. So maybe on this point, it is true that minorities and political groups, especially the opposition groups, are always in the defense, and the state can utilize its power to go on an overdrive. So I think the defense of this space of critical news, I must thank the online creation of freedom of expression, whether it was designed or it just sort of bulldozed itself in this new world, I think has given a more level playing field. Because as much as the state wants to control the detailing of such information flow, I suppose unless you're probably like China that sort of has its own bubble to contain information, most other countries are part of the free movement of information. I think that has itself created a counter power to tweet at that very second something to counter what the minister has just said like 1 minute ago, and then it has a life of its own, and then the government then is now on the defensive to explain itself. And for me, if the government is on the defensive to explain itself, which means the government is now duty bound to respect the citizens and people of the nation right to information, which before it never thought it was important to explain to people what it did and why it did. But now, because of the so-called allegation or negative perception, government is taking much more effort and energy. I think there's another question about education, what someone asked, which I agree, that much more should be in public education and campaigning on how to manage fake news. And I think as I read to you, I'm getting an SMS from the centralized government system that just reminds people, oh, if you are not sure of a message, please check on this website or check. So simple messages. I think it may cost a little bit more, but I think it's the government now has a duty to do that, and so is a private sector. So I think this opening up of space is a moderation, but I suppose there are much more tougher regimes in Southeast Asia. I see a question on Myanmar and other countries. I mean, it's different. Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. The range of that space for human rights is different. But my call is that it should be more. And I think the test of a good government is the ability to painfully hear the comments, the critical comments, the sharp comments that you may not agree, although you were chosen as a government. But that's what being government is. You took up the job in order to hear the full range, the ones that will clap for you and the ones that will disagree with you. And for me, that's the test of a good government, which is something the culture of Asia, which is, I think, part of our very feudal culture in Southeast Asia and many parts of Asia, is that for a long time we were brought up, or we were taught, the adults, the elders, the top leaders need the word respect, and it should be done in a much more calmer way, much more pleasant way. And I think that's perhaps a more cultural nuance without taking that freedom of expression. So I think if you want to criticize, then your criticism can have in the most decent of cultural languages. That's, for me, is fine. You can be as critical. Number two, your test would be whether what you are saying is inciting violence or hate against a particular group. I think there's some tests. I think the Rabat Plan of Action sort of helps us go there. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, thank you, Gerald. I'm going to broaden the scope a little geographically here. We're getting a lot of questions about extra-national pressures and roles of institutions as well. So that there's a strong question from Panellists about ASEAN. Could ASEAN play a stronger role in guiding information policies regionally? But so with an eye on ASEAN, but also looking more broadly, the internet is extraterritorial in many senses. It makes it extremely hard for national structures to manage and monitor it, unless you're going to generate a national firewall in the sense that China has largely taken forward. And so the question then comes as to how national bodies should be linking with international bodies, and indeed how they relate to tech firms themselves, to the platforms, to Facebook and Twitter and many others. So from that perspective, maybe if I turn to Tess first of all, given that your presentation earlier was very much dealing from a regional perspective, how do you see that panning out, both with ASEAN as a potential body that could play a role here, and then more broadly still, should the UN be more engaged in regulation? How can one establish norms, patterns, ways of managing and regulating hate speech or negative content, while also generating and enabling the space for freedom of speech to flourish?
If you look at the track record of ASEAN and going by how it has responded to what's happened in Myanmar, I'm sorry if I sound very pessimistic, but I've written about ASEAN issues. I mean, as a regional bloc, I don't think we can see it. We can see a very solid response to this issue by ASEAN, because it's still very divided. And again, going back to how it has responded to the Myanmar coup, there's no meaningful and united response. So I don't see how, it can be expected to take the lead in coming up with, region-wide policies, etc. And given that it's pretty much stuck to its principle of non-interference, so again, I don't have a lot of hope if we talk about ASEAN. I would rather look at what other institutions within the region, especially civil society groups, can do in this regard. Maybe put pressure on ASEAN, but at the rate things are going, again, things don't look very promising. Yeah.
Thank you, Tess, for those sobering thoughts. Gerald, is there anything you'd like to add?
So I think on ASEAN, ASEAN prides itself in being a regional organization in Asia, the only functioning regional organization in Asia. And it has its own standard called the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. It in itself has put out to the world what it says it believes. Article 23 of that declaration actually speaks about the defense of freedom of expression and opinion. And so we will have to push the state governments in ensuring that they comply to their own language. And they've even set up an ASEAN Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission. I must tell you, it does not comply with the Paris Principle for Human Rights Commission, which is an independent body, but it is set out to live the spirit of the ASEAN Charter and the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, which means just recently, the body, the ASEAN Human Rights Commission, also adopted a mechanism where you can submit information and complaints to the body. Never before, but now for the first time, they are receiving complaints. So I think we should test this to push the Commission, to push ASEAN to give flesh to its own standard setting in the region. But knowing ASEAN, because of its non-interference policy, it is very don't disturb thy neighbor policy. It sort of does very little to take up an issue across the border. But the standard has been set by itself, and I think we should work at it, which is probably linked to another question. If I continue, Adam, on the broader question of the United Nations, you're right. We are hoping our fight in our country is to defend what we believe is human rights for all citizens and people in the country. But it can be aided by other standards, regional and international standards. So regional, I gave you the example. International standards, there's so many good standards, the Rabat Plan of Action, the United Nations Declaration, the Special Report. There's a lot flowing, but how has that come in to work with the state? I think that's where the gap is. Very little intervention or technical, the word is technical advice or technical support by the UN on this very crucial, difficult areas. And the areas are difficult because one is there are cultural issues, there are religious sensitivities, there are feudal legacy issues and power play. I think the UN must, or the expert, the international expert must bring to ground, how do you have this conversation to push those limits, And I think I'm learning from one person here, Marie Schroeter, who sort of proposed, I use it as a proposal of using artificial intelligence, to fight disinformation. I think perhaps this is something not tested, and I'm not familiar, but I've always wondered how is this done, because the non-state actors like NGOs, civil society, even the Human Rights Commission, we get attacked a lot online because of the positions we take, but we don't have that energy and the resources to have 100 people waiting online to answer. But maybe this could be the next phase of answering disinformation. But I'm excited to learn how this could work. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, thank you, Gerald. I wanted to make just a very quick comment myself about how different organizations can play a role and what role there is for technical responses, which comes up in one of the questions here. And from there, we can perhaps broaden it a little. There's a question from Marie Schroeter about state-led automation solutions, machine learning, and so on. From the research we've been doing, we published a paper late last year about social media and conflict patterns across Southeast Asia. And there is clearly a role for automated solutions, but automated solutions don't just mean turning a machine on and letting it run. You have to set the ground rules by which the machine is filtering messages, of course. And particularly when people know how to game the ground rules by using code or using pseudonyms or words with different meanings, then it can be extremely challenging. There's also the issue in many countries of many different languages, some of which aren't necessarily even formally written down in one sole way or one sole script. So you've got a huge set of challenges to address there, and that does have a massive human element. There's no way to get around that. And what you've seen with some of the tech companies, the likes of Facebook and so on, it is a shift from building up huge numbers of monitors, employing hundreds or thousands of people to try and monitor the internet and feed into these automated systems, towards something that's a bit more diffused and relies more on other actors. So relies on working with civil society groups in places with government, with media outfits, with news agencies, and including some quite well-known names, both in the civil society activist field and in the media field, to play a role in monitoring hate speech and fake news, while from the platform's perspective, enabling them to keep it open and maintain their business. From the perspective of freedom of expression and speech, being able to maintain the transfer and passage of information. So that, to me, it's what I've found again and again is that it's the multi-stakeholder approach that's increasingly being stressed, whether it goes up to international organizations who can establish greater norms, through down to the local level, where bodies can be involved in monitoring in different senses, but also can be involved at the grassroots in education and awareness raising and literacy, critical information literacy. Although on that last point, you know, that's a challenge globally, including in very developed, very educated societies. So one has to be realistic about what it can achieve in a range of different environments. More specifically, Tess and Gerald, I thought either of you may have comments on what can be done on grassroots measures or on more specific measures at the local level or regionally, indeed, through networking and other measures that you've seen that are really worth drawing attention to as something that can be adapted and regulated elsewhere.
I'll pick up your point about multi-stakeholder approach. This was something that we had been thinking about, at SIPA, because realizing that we needed to broaden the scope of discussions to include other sectors of society, but so it cannot be the usual players, you know, or actors in this regard. We need to determine to what extent are we going to expand the scope of a multi-stakeholder approach to include, as you mentioned, grassroots based communities, for example, even groups that are being marginalized, for example, so that they have a voice in the discussion. At the very least, we need to determine, for example, who are the main actors participating in the discussion, who are being excluded, and who need to be included, so that the discussion is broader, it's more nuanced, it's more inclusive of different perspectives. That's how we look at it. One solution that keeps coming up in many conversations that I have participated in is the need for more digital and media literacy. And I fully agree that it's something that really has to be pushed. But I think we need to take a look at, is there something about the way we're doing it that may not be working, or that may not really bringing about a more enlightened citizenry when it comes to what really is news, for example, or how can they distinguish fake news from legitimate news? We need to be looking at how we're doing it, who's involved, what is working and what is not working, so that along the way it becomes more it becomes more effective. Definitely, we need media literacy, but it's interesting that even for a country like the Philippines, where you would expect that public officials, for example, would be more familiar with the workings of the media, by their statements, by their pronouncements, they expose their ignorance of how the media should work. So, it's easy to label something as fake news simply because it's not good for your image or the institution that you represent. But if you examine how exactly the media should be doing its work, and how it's supposed to come up with the fact-based news, it's then you would think twice before calling something fake news. But there's a lot of misunderstanding, and that's been exposed in pronouncements being issued by public officials. So what is the extent to which we're going to pursue media literacy? Who should be involved? We cannot just be looking at uneducated people, for example, but even those in positions of power who may not understand, for example, the workings of the media, that make it easy for them to pass laws that are violative of fundamental freedom. So there's a lot of thinking and rethinking that has to be done before even coming up with what we think are concrete solutions to the kinds of issues that we're talking about.
Gerald.
Yeah. Just to take up the question by Yulia, in Malaysia, there's a department under the Prime Minister's office called Special Affairs Department. In short, we call it JASA. In the old government, it was officially known as the Propaganda Unit, and this is government utilizing public funds for not dissemination of information, but for propaganda, for defense of the government of the day. And this cannot be public office function. So I think there's a lot of criticism on a role and function on JASA. In the old days, there used to be a department of information that used to go with a van with the loud speakers telling people what the government has decided. That's now taken over by propaganda. And I think this is what we need to counter, to say that if you want to defend your political party work, you do it on your own time. But the government is duty bound to give information of its policies and explain its policies. So I think that kind of nuancing between political party and government, I think, is what this open space is now challenging leaders, because every time they say something, people say, oh, you're doing it just to win political party. That kind of cynical view, I think, is good. That government people are differentiating that what I'm doing now is as minister, and then the weekend I'm not a minister, I'm the member of parliament for my party in the ground. So I think that kind of professionalizing is also happening via the criticism and the cynicism of the common public. Number two, I think your question, Adam, on the grassroots, what can we do? I think there's a lot of scope, because the internet penetration, the smartphone penetration, I'm having conversations regularly with indigenous people from different villages now who's on some Facebook group, and they are giving their viewpoints, very critical, very cynical. And so there is a space of discuss and connection. I think that numbers are growing fast and quick, and I think we need to find a way to have that conversation, utilizing internet. And internet connectivity is, when about 20 years ago, I used to go to one of the interior areas of Sarawak where now the dam is being built. Just 6 months ago, they have a tower, and I can actually send photos on WhatsApp to the village headman there. I was shocked because I haven't seen him for decades, and he said hello, and now we can communicate, we can laugh. I mean, this is a real changing space that gives both sides an opportunity for people on the ground, for media to even take their message to the ground. But I think I'm still, as I said, I'm interested in how technology, artificial intelligence could be one countermeasure for disinformation. Number two, strengthening of CSO, civil society organizations. Maybe in Malaysia, we are very small. These numbers are very small. The organizing are 2 or 3 staff. Resources are difficult. So I think how to also build up the strength of civil society organization in order to respond and to be counter message is important. And then number 3 is how to change the narrative. This is specifically, I speak on Malaysia, because the issue of 3 R's, they say, the state always exploits race, religion, and royalty to try to win a particular big part of the country to support their political narrative. So everything is sensitive. Oh, you're challenging the majority race narrative because this is the ethnic majority. So don't say that, and you're wrong, and you are anti. Same for religion. Islam is a majority, and even you have no intention. You never said, but can easily be twisted. In 2018, there was a huge campaign to fight against the ratification of the International Convention on Against Racial Discrimination. Malaysia is not a party to that. And suddenly they got 50,000 people on the ground to fight against this because the politicians who are now in power told people that this is going to take away identity as the Malay majority, are going to affect our religion, Islam, and will affect the royalty. So I think we need counter narrative to speak to people. And I would want to actually say we need independent journalists and journalists, media houses. I think there's too little in Malaysia. For a brief period, for 2 years, the media houses suddenly became freer, independent. But now when the new government came, they're still a bit free, but still not that loud voice like you hear in the Philippines papers or Indonesian papers to actually challenge when a government minister says something illogical. There are very few tough questions coming from the journalists. So I think that's part of what I think can help us move forward. Thank you.
We're running close to the end. I'm going to ask a couple more very, very brief and succinct questions to both Gerald and Tess as final words. When you look at the current context, and I'm responding to some of the other questions here, it's a very challenging global environment at the moment. You do have messages coming from events in Western countries, and I'm not just talking about the recent acquittal of Donald Trump, as the question states. I'm talking more broadly about what happened over the previous 4 years there, and indeed in many European countries. So this is not just a trend in Asian or developing countries where freedom of speech is being challenged, and online information in particular is being gamed very directly by political actors. You can look at what happened in the UK in the run-up to the Brexit vote, for instance, as being a classic example of a fairly dubious use of information. So in this current environment, and then of course, when you look at more specific political trends, as in Myanmar recently, which is extremely hard to know how to respond to that. And I don't think there is any simple answer as to how different actors should respond. It's very early days. People have a lot of interests and needs, including safety and security, to balance and have to work out an appropriate way forward, which also doesn't polarize and fence in people who need to be brought into a debate. So many challenging issues to address there across the board. When it comes down to how one can actually respond in this environment, I think there are a lot of positive lessons too. And that there have been some really, really positive examples and experiences. So as a final note, I'd like to ask perhaps Gerald and then Tess, to give Tess the final word for an example, if they can think of one, of something they've seen that's worked well, that has managed in a challenging global environment, which encompasses old media and new media, to build more space or fortify or develop laws and protection for freedom of speech. It could be something very small, or it could be something very, very large. Sorry to put you on the spot, Gerald, but is there anything that comes to mind?
Well,
in a minute, 1 minute you have.
Yeah, so I think part of it is to challenge power. And I say this probably is prompted by the Trump question, is that whenever we can take state leaders to answer for their questions, so they are not, that there is no impunity, then like our prime minister is now under trial for corruption, a few ministers have been charged. And so even the very fact that bringing Trump for impeachment, I think, is how you test the waters on people overstepping their limits. So I think this will ensure that no minister abuses and uses the propaganda tools at his hand, because when his or her time limit is up, you can be sure something in history may come creeping up to you, and you'll have to answer to the people. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Tess.
Something came to mind as you were asking for example. And I think this illustrates some of the things that need to be done in response to what we're talking about. There's this regional NGO. When I say regional, it's Asia in scope. The thought of, because they're based in the Philippines but doing a lot of work in different parts of Asia, the thought of training this group of indigenous youth in the Philippines to document the abuses being perpetrated by the military, because in the Philippine context, there's a lot of reports, and this has been documented in terms of the violations of human rights of indigenous people. You know, they're being dispossessed of their ancestral lands, etc. So what this NGO did was, because the media was not coming to them, the mainstream, to report, you know, the kinds of incidents taking place in their community. So what they did was to train this group of indigenous youth to document using simple phones, you know, the abuses happening in their community. And it turned out to be very empowering. I mentioned that because in this time of pandemic, there's a lot of talk about the new normal. Maybe we also need to be thinking in terms of what new ways do we need to be considering, and what old normal do we need to be setting aside in the way CSO groups, for example, are doing their work, pursuing their specific advocacies, in the way media is doing its work, because the media certainly has a lot of rethinking to do in terms of how it's doing its stories, normally just going to, you know, the usual sources, the usual public officials being approached to give statements, but forgetting that out there are so many other group sectors that need to have a voice in the public conversation. So my challenge would be, and to us in this discussion, maybe think in terms of what new normal do we need to be doing, and what old ways of thinking do we need to discard in response to these very challenging times that may no longer, to which the solutions we may have been trying to, you know, to offer have not, no longer work. So I think the challenge also is not just to the government to scrap those laws, but also to us in different sectors of society, and then coming together, maybe as a regional community, as a global community, to pursue our collective advocacies and respond to the challenges that are not specific to individual countries, but to the region in general, and then to the global community. I think I'll end on that note. Yeah.
So we're right out of time. Thanks very much indeed, Gerald and Tess, for some excellent, concise and very perceptive responses. I think this has been an engaging and challenging discussion. Impossible to cover everything in the time allowed, given how vast ranging its scope is. I hope we've answered most of the questions as thoroughly as we can. And it remains just to wish you, Gerald and Tess, and of course everybody who's been listening, thanks very much indeed for your time, and the best of health. All the best.